Hello everyone, Bryce here from VKF. I am here today to give you guys a setup guide. I'm going to be going through kind of every setup option that we have inside of the sim in Kart Racing Pro. I'm currently doing this guide on the Miami X30, which is what we're going to be running for the European Open and the North American Open, although some of the things I talk about in this video are going to be applicable to the Mini that we use in the RJD Championship. Basically, everything I talk about will apply to that kart, but the settings will have different number values, but the same thing will happen to the way the kart drives, depending on the adjustment you make. So, without further ado, let's get into it. First, obviously, we have fuel. This is really just going to depend on the length of the race. Most main events in a full-size kart, you're going to be at 4 liters. If it's a shorter main, it'll be at 3. I would really recommend downloading MaxHUD if you don't have it. You have a fuel calculator there, so you can really see how long your fuel runs get you at each track, and then see how much you need based on the length of the final and laps at each track. So next we have tires. You have race, practice, wet. Pretty self-explanatory. You can switch tire sets here if you wear them out. Also, if the infinite tire sets is unchecked on a server, you can just refresh and it'll fully refresh your set of tires here and give you a fresh set, so they're just as grippy as when you first get them and not worn. On VKF servers we'll have this on, so you can just refresh. We're not going to limit your tire sets. Next, brake leverage. This is really just a preference. If you go up, you see you get to low here. This will basically just make the brake pedal more sensitive to inputs. If you go to medium, I usually run it at medium. You run it high, it'll make it less sensitive. Really personal preference on how you like your brake to feel. Next, we get into the engine. Now, this is where the big bulk of performance comes between having a default setup and a made setup. So first we'll get into idle. Usually you're going to want this between 0 and 10. This basically adjusts if the engine is going to hold a little tiny bit of throttle when you are completely off the gas. Now, this sounds a little weird, but it is an adjustment on real-life engines, as most people probably know. You're going to want this between 1 and 10. 10 is the highest I would go. Basically, the drawback you get is it's hard to slow the kart down because it has too much gas on it. But the benefit of having a little bit of idle is it can keep your revs up in the middle of the corner, so it has a little bit more of a get up and go on the gas. I'll usually run it around the middle of this range, depending on the track and the temperature. If it's really, really hot in whatever server you're in, for some reason, all of our VKF servers will not be, so you won't have to worry about this. You'll want to run a lower idle if it's really hot, because then the engine will overheat even when you're off the gas. But again, VKF servers will not have that issue, so you can run the idle wherever you like it. Next we go to carb. Literally, run this at 2. Do not change it. Every single engine you run this at 2. It is the fastest setting on any temperature, any track. You will leave this on 2. There is no change to it. 2 is much faster than 4. If you've been running 4 the whole time you've been on this game and you run it to 2, you will notice the speed difference. It is much quicker. Radiator cover, temperature and track dependent, really, engine dependent. I usually don't touch this and just adjust it on track with the keybinds you can set in the settings. Really up to you. Next, we'll get into chassis. So, axle. This is where it gets a little bit more complicated. First, we have our axle options, and we have the compound. So first, you'll notice here we have a compound, and then we have a number. So the compound is going to adjust, obviously, the stiffness of the axle. Now, how does that translate into the way the kart drives? Basically, the softer the axle, the more rear end you will feel the kart have, and the less front end. So it will take more input and longer for the kart to respond to front end inputs, and it will have a more rear grip. I usually go from the medium to the stiffer end of this based on my personal preference, but again, it's how you want the kart to drive. So, say you want a kart that has a really darty front end, you're going to go ultra hard. If you want a kart that has kind of in the middle of that, you're going to go to the medium. And then you might be confused here because you have 3 options for every single compound. So we have the numbers here. These numbers indicate the width of the axle that you're putting on. So generally what I like to run is really track dependent. So you run a 1020, it's narrower, you're going to have slightly more rear bite on that than you will on a 1040, but then again you have the chance of it binding up. This is basically just you go a little bit stiffer and a little bit softer with these. So the number is less something you need to pay attention to, but I generally run 1040, but you can experiment with what you like. The main thing that will make you feel a big difference in the cart is going to be the actual compound of it. We're really splitting hairs between these over here. I have not noticed a huge difference, at least in the game. Next, we're going to go to these. Usually, you're just going to leave these tight. The front bar, stiffer it is, the more front end it's going to give the cart. It's really all it is. Softer is less front. Stiffer is more front. You're going to leave these tight too. I usually leave this out. You never really use a rear bar in this game. Just don't touch it. Again, leave the crash bars tight. Next we get to hubs. Now, these are something in the game that kind of everyone sets up a little differently. They don't make a huge difference. I don't really play around with them much. Generally, these aren't going to make a big difference to the way the cart drives. They're a very minor adjustment, but generally where you stiffen up the cart is where it's going to get some grip. So you put on a longer hub, it's going to stiffen it up. It's going to give you a little bit more grip in that area. Yeah, I generally like to run these stiffer. That's just my preference. Again, experiment with it. That's the whole thing with this game, is finding what setup you like. One setup isn't going to be best for everyone. And now we move on to seat. This single adjustment right here, horizontal, will make the biggest difference to the front to rear balance of your go-kart out of any other thing in this game. The smaller the value, the more front end you have. The bigger the value, the more rear end you have. I would not recommend going above 58, honestly. You want to stay below 58 or 60, depending on if you really like a cart that pushes into a corner and has no front end, you can run it higher. You're going to get a lot more front end out of it running this lower. Again, I adjust this track to track. My baseline, I keep it at one value, but it really depends on what you like. This is basically just a shift of front to rear, so you can kind of manage your axle and your seat area to kind of get a balance that you like in the cart. One other thing I forgot to mention with the axle is the way the cart will pick up and set down the inside rear in each corner with these. So say you put on a medium axle and you want it to pick up a little quicker and have a little bit more front end, you're going to go to a hard. Say you want it to pick up a little slower, you're going to go to a soft. So basically, these will make the lift and set down happen faster, which can be good and can be bad, because then you can overload the cart and it'll snap back down and you'll bounce and you'll hop. And, you know, you just got to play around with what you like. Balancing these two out to get a feel in the cart that is good front to rear. Next we have vertical. Honestly, set it between 0 and 2 and see what you like. This will affect how much the cart will lift in each corner, how much weight will transfer to the outside of the cart. You set this too high, you're going to be flipping over, especially in the mini carts. If you're in the minis and you set this anywhere really above 1, it's going to be a little unstable and you might hit a curb and flip. You can run this at 0 in a mini and it'll still feel like that. So you can imagine this will exaggerate that a lot. In the minis, the values for the seat will be a little different and all of your axle options will be different. But what I was saying about how it affects the way the cart balances front to rear will stay the same. Next we have stays. Again, a personal preference thing. This also just changes the stiffness of the rear. Basically the same concept from before applied to the stays. Next, drivetrain. This is kind of a basic concept. I'll go over it briefly since some people don't know. The higher gear you go on the rear sprocket, the more bottom end and less top end you'll have. The engine will top out sooner at the end of the straight. And the higher front sprocket you have, it's opposite. So the higher front sprocket you have, you'll have less bottom end and more top end. So if I ran a 1073, or sorry, we go back 1087, that would be the most bottom end, least top end I could run. Again, this is track dependent and depends on your driving style. If you're in a race and you're starting from the back and you're going to be depending on passing a lot, you might need a little bit more power. You might go up a tooth or two. If you're running right at the front, you're going to be drafting the whole race. You might go down a tooth. So it really depends. It's situational. Generally in the X30 package, you're going to want to top out and hit that rev limiter just before you go into the first corner at the end of the longest straight on the track or fastest point. Just play around with it until you feel like you have a good bottom end and you're not bogging too much. The mini karts are very different. You're going to set those up to be kind of lower RPM everywhere because that's where the power seems to be. So generally on the minis, you're going to be at a 13 front tooth driver, which you can't even do on these Miami X30 karts. But yeah. Next, another big page, a lot of options. This is very daunting to new players. You know, it's a lot of settings to put in one place. So this is where this setting can come into play. I basically never touch this unless you should. If you're racing on an oval, you touch this. This just lets you set the settings different from each side of the kart. So I can set 20 or 17 degrees of caster over here and still keep 21 on this side. You'll never really do that. First, we'll go up to ratio and Ackerman in the steer settings. The lower the value here, the quicker the response of the steering wheel will be. So this is different from what I was talking about before with balance of the kart. This is straight up how sensitive the steering wheel will be to your input. So if you put these at a lower value, you'll notice that your force feedback will be noticeably stiffer in the wheel, and it will take less input for the kart to turn into a corner. You'll have to put less wheel into it for the kart to react more. So if you like really reactive, twitchy steering, you'll set these lower. That's how I like to drive it. Some people like to run 2-1 or 1-2. It really depends what you like. Yeah, so it's really just personal preference of how sensitive you like that steering wheel to be. Caster, this changes how much the kart will hike the inside rear based on your steering input. Again, I don't really ever touch this. I just kind of leave it at default. It seems to be fine there. And now we'd go to camber. This is generally going to be a negative number usually. I'm never really a positive on this value. This can just add and take out a little bit of front end because you're just reducing the contact patch on the front tires is all you're really doing here. So again, this is personal preference of taking very slight amounts of front end out of it. Can also change the way the kart lifts a little bit, but generally it's just a little bit of front end. Next we go ride height. Now, this is where it gets tricky. Ride height is very subjective to how you like to drive. And again, the track, you might run a higher ride height if you're on a track where you're going to be eating curbs a lot and you don't want the kart to bottom out. But again, pay attention to your ride height when you go out because the kart can flip. It's very prone to it. KRP has a problem with it. If you're on a high ride height, you have a chance you'll flip if you turn too hard. So again, careful. So yeah, this is very subjective. Usually you'll get a little bit more lift out of the kart. It'll be more eager to lift the inside rear and transfer weight to the outside the higher your ride height is. That goes for the front and the rear. You're always generally going to want to run them the rear a little bit higher than the front. That's just kind of how it goes. Again, adjust to personal preference. This is more of a guide on just telling you what things do than giving you a setup to use. Next we go to toe out. So this can make the kart a little bit more responsive into the corners and make the steering feel a little nicer if you run more of it, but do pay attention that it can give you some drag in the front wheels as you're essentially pointing the front wheels in towards each other a little bit. So generally you'll want to stick to underneath 1.5 and adjust it from there. 1.5 to the 0 range. Next we go to track width. So this is just going to change the width of the front of the kart, very self-explanatory. The wider you go, the more of a pivot there will be on the steering, which again will change more lift in the rear if you widen this up. So it can make the kart, again, flippy. You make the kart way wide in the front, really high up off the ground, it's going to flip over. That's how it works. So you really adjust this. This is a fine-tuning adjustment of front and rear grip. Don't go too extreme on this either way. Generally, you want to keep it somewhere in the middle range. Same with the minis. The minis can be, you can push it farther on the minis with how far on the track width you go. You can go to the extremes on the minis without much consequence, but on the full-size karts, you don't want to do that. Next, we're going to go to, we already talked about ride height. We're going to go to rear track width. Same principles really apply here, except you run it really narrow. You might have some more rear grip, but you run the risk of binding up the go-kart, and that'll just sap your power and your exit speed. You'll get to the middle of the corner, and you'll feel it lift, 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 and it'll set, and it'll bind up, and then it'll just slow you down off the corner. You don't really know what a bound up cart feels like till you drive it, so you got to experiment with how you like the cart to drive. Generally, again, run this in the middle, because if you run it way out here, I've never done that. You might lose some lift in the cart, and it might not drive exactly how you want. So I'd say keep this in the middle range, just to play around with it from each track. I change this from track to track, both of these track widths. So, yeah, last thing we're going to talk about, tire pressure. The team I started KRP with when I first started running with teams, and then eventually created my own a while ago, a few years back. Not Track Magic, different teams now. And then joined FPR, obviously, which is the team I had the longest run with. I switched over to using bar for pressure and gotten used to it. You can use PSI. My general rule is you look at these after you come off the track, and you want your temps on these readings to generally be between 65 and 80 is a decent temperature range, but I'd say keep it 65 to 70 is a better range to be in when you come off the track, temperature wise. So you can do your runs, see what you like for pressure. You can obviously adjust pressure front to rear. I never see a need for it a lot, but if you really want to get specific, you can go asymmetric and stagger your pressures if you really want to. Again, that's only if you have a track with a ton of left-handers or a ton of right-handers. And generally, even on those kinds of tracks, I don't feel a need to do it in KRP like you would in real life. But yeah, that's a setup guide for you guys. I look forward to seeing everyone on track, and I hope this video was helpful for you. If you have any other questions that aren't just asking me for my setup or what I do for X or Y or Z, definitely let me know. Message me about it. But now that you know what all these settings do, you can go through them and you can change them to your taste. And if you have a way you want the cart to drive, you can do it. Generally, get the cart to a baseline where it feels good, and you get the carb and the gear where they need to be, you're going to be on at least close to on pace. Whereas if you're on default setup, you're going to be a ways off. So I hope this video was helpful to everyone. Good luck on track, and I'll see you at VKF.